You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning into the show. Before I introduce today's guest, I wanted to share some exciting news. We just launched a brand new website for the podcast. You can head over to retaildisrupted.com to get more information on the show, to access the full backlog of episodes, and also there are new ways that you can get in touch with me. So you can email me on natalie@retaildisrupted.com, but you can also leave me a voice note, which I think is very cool, and I'm excited to test out this feature. But yes, you can record audio. Head over to retaildisrupted.com. You can record an audio message. That will get pinged to me and the team. I'd love to hear what's working, what I can improve, what guests you want to hear from, what topics you want to hear about. And also, if you have any feedback on the website, I'm all ears. So please do either send me an email or test out this voice note feature and let me know what you think. Okay, on today's show, we are talking about independent retail and how an online wholesale marketplace is breaking down barriers, disrupting the status quo, and making it easier for indies to connect with brands and makers around the globe. Charlotte Broadbent is the UK General Manager of Faire. She joined the US-founded business in 2022, which was an exciting time because the company was starting to pivot to focus on international expansion. During her time at Faire, she has led major category expansion, go-to-market strategy, and partnership projects. Prior to this, Charlotte served as the COO of an international fine jewelry brand and retailer, Tamara Comolli. Before that, she worked in private equity, where she assessed and delivered new investments focused on the retail and consumer sectors. It was during this time that Charlotte came to the realization that she wanted to roll up her sleeves to become more involved in the operational side of the business. And that eventually led her to her role at Faire today. Let's welcome Charlotte to the podcast. Charlotte, welcome to Retail Disrupted. It's great to have you here on the show.
Thank you for having me, Natalie. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me as well, because we're going to talk all about Faire and we're going to get your views on independent retail. So we have a lot to talk about. But first, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I lead Faire's operations in the UK, and we'll talk a bit in the moment about who Faire is. I've been with the company for 3 years, but for me, joining Faire was actually a pivot from a first part of my career in finance and specifically in private equity, where I was investing in retail and consumer businesses, which is really where I cut my teeth and started to understand but come to love retail businesses. I've moved in 2020 from being on the investor side to the operating side and became COO of one of my portfolio companies, which was actually a jewellery brand and retailer based in Germany, but with shops and wholesale relationships globally. And it was that experience, I think, helped me pivot into Faire at a really exciting time in 2022 now, when the US founded business was starting to pivot and focus on European expansion.
So let's talk a little bit more about Faire, because Faire is a relatively new entrant to the UK market. And a lot of listeners will probably be familiar with Etsy, but maybe don't know that much about Faire. So can you tell us a little bit more about the business, how it all works, what you've done to disrupt the industry, and how you're helping small businesses?
Yeah, sure. So Faire is probably the biggest retailer that your listeners have maybe never heard of. And the reason for that is that we are a B2B retailer. We sell products to retailers who then sell themselves onto the end consumer. We were the first and we're now the largest global B2B marketplace, and we connect brands who want to sell wholesale to specifically independent retailers. um, we were born out of the insight that actually, if you add up all of the independent retailers in the world, and it's just an enormous market, it's more than the combined value of the Walmarts and the Amazons many times over. Um, and the independent retailers, I think, were really the original influencers in many ways, and continue to um, push innovation as far as the high street and retail market goes. But they were underserved in terms of access to technology, access to
Mhm.
financing, and some of the tools that we know all of the big players have in bucket loads. And what we're doing as Faire is helping level the playing field by bringing the collective power of all of those independents to bear. And to give you a sense of scale and why I think your listeners should be hearing about us, is that having just been in the UK for 3 years now, we already have over 50,000 independent retailers shopping with us in the UK alone, and many hundreds of thousands globally. So it's really a silent revolution that's been happening in the world of wholesale.
I guess this is a sector that had, up until recently, been operating mostly offline. So how have you really disrupted the sector? What are independent retailers getting today? I mean, I know you've just alluded to access to technology and democratizing that, which is huge. How was it working before?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that it's an industry that until recently has largely operated offline. And in truth, it still does today, because we're still quite new, and believe that we've just reached the kind of tip of the iceberg in terms of the opportunity. But this is an industry with a lot of middlemen between the retailer and the manufacturer, brand, or producer of products that retailer is selling to consumers. And those range from distributors, sales agents, trade shows, um, all of whom were taking their cut, and creating inefficiency in the market. And what we do is directly connect the independent retailer with the brand who's supplying those products in an online way, so that they have a direct relationship, and bringing that online. A lot of wholesale buying was traditionally done twice a year at buying moments around trade shows. So typically in January, just after Christmas, when everything had sold out, and about now, actually in September, when retailers were thinking about buying for Christmas. And what that meant was uh, retailers were having to make big bets and cash outlays on what was going to fly off their shelves for that season, which is quite scary as a retailer, actually, because if something doesn't sell and you've got a stock room full of it, you're either having to discount it, or worse, throw it away, which obviously all goes to margin and business sustainability. By bringing that online, and what we specifically do at Faire to help independent retailers, is wholesale buying can happen 365 days of the year. In fact, some of our retailers that I speak to love to share with me that they are shopping for their store on Faire in the bath on their iPad, or in bed at night with a cup of tea. So it's happening all the time. And we also, because we're aggregating uh, orders from many independents, allow them to buy in much smaller quantities and values. So top up little and often, which we know reduces risk in that system of buying, so that they can be more agile, respond and react to what's selling and what's not, and that they're not going to have that stock room full of things getting dusty
Yeah.
at the end of the week.
That's so interesting because that very much feels like the direction to travel within retail, looking outside of independent retail and just looking at kind of the Sheins and the Temus of the world, and being able to ramp up production if you know that something's selling and you're reducing waste and you're giving customers
Mm,
what they want. Yeah, that's it's just so fascinating that we're seeing this trend
yeah.
permeate throughout the wider sector.
And independent's actually a much better place to be more agile in that sense than the big players, because it's typically the owner who is also the buyer. They don't have long lead times like the John Lewises of this world who have 12, 18-month buying cycles, and they can react to trends, consumer demand, and be more agile in this market.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned agility because I wanted to touch on the fact there's no secret, independent retailers generally have had a really tough few years with Brexit, the pandemic, cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
And these were three very different, but also very interwoven forms of disruption that required retailers to change very quickly, to pivot, to almost overnight digitally transform their businesses. And I think one thing that was interesting from an independent retail perspective was just seeing how quickly independent retailers could get online because they had to. It was out of necessity. And I think we've also seen the resilience of independent retailers certainly shine through. But there are still a lot of hurdles. Some of these are perennial hurdles, things like business rates. And
Mm.
I'd love to, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, but I just love to get your take on the current state of play. So, what do you see as the biggest challenges facing independent retailers today?
Look, there's no denying, as you said, that it's been a tough period of what's felt like omni crisis, and independent retailers have shown incredible resilience and ingenuity, and it's one of the best parts of my job. It is getting to spend time with them and hear about how they're overcoming those challenges. And I'm not a fan of being kind of super gloomy and saying, "Oh, it's going to get worse before it gets better." And I really like to focus on the optimism that we see in the sector. I think a challenge actually remains embracing digital transformation. I think there's a lot that's been done in terms of independent retailers embracing omni-channel strategies. We know from our customers that pre-pandemic, only a third of them had an online presence. Today, that's 90%, to put it in
Wow.
perspective.
Wow.
And those retailers are combining in-store experiences with their online sales to reach a wider audience, and getting really innovative with how they use social media to engage their local audiences. I mentioned that we see independent retailers as the original kind of influencers, and that's really true because they have that close connection with their customers, being local as they are. And actually, particularly with the shift to at-home working, a lot of our retailers are seeing footfall midweek that they didn't see in the past. Which has kind of changed the buying patterns and the amount of newness that they need to bring into store, which I find super interesting. So keeping up with that pace of change is definitely one of the challenges. I also think competing on value is a challenge for independent retail. Then not only do they need to be delivering on the experience and product selection, but they do need to compete on value. And that's something that we've really tried to help with at Faire, because we're giving retailers access to a much wider selection. We have over 100,000 brands that are selling on our platform. So retailers can really compare and contrast, and brands sell at their best prices on Faire as well. So we're helping retailers compete, but in the fight for consumers' pockets, they need to show value as well. And you mentioned rates, and I think it's top of mind. But when I chat with retailers, rates is one of kind of 50 issues that they face, and we'll be watching keenly for the budget next month, and what's going to be put in place for retailers and particularly independents.
Yeah, and you just touched on the breadth of range that you offer being a marketplace. And I wonder if there's any insights that you could share around specific categories. I had a look on your website earlier and I noticed that you sell everything from barbecue sauce to engagement rings. So it is a range. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I guess anything you could share around uh, categories and maybe where you're seeing growth and if there's been anything that's has surprised you over the years.
Yeah, I love that you've had a good look around the website, and I encourage your listeners to as well. We are the one-stop shop for wholesale in many senses, and we now have millions of products available globally, and that can seem a little overwhelming to retailers on first glance. But what we've invested in a lot, particularly improving the experience in recent years, is on helping retailers filter down to the things that are most relevant for them. I think we sell more candles than anyone else in the UK to stores, but we also have hugely growing categories in food and drink and clothing. But in terms of trends, I think what's interesting, because we're at the wholesale end of the businesses, we have and making millions of connections and sales between brands and retailers, is we have some foresight on what's coming in the market and what retailers are looking for. So last year, for instance, we saw a huge spike in demand for Barbie related products, or just pink in general, which was wonderful to see. And we could see that well in advance of, the movie being released in the summer. Um, but actually, taking a step back, one of the biggest trends that we see in our data is the trend towards values-based shopping. Part of retailers kind of delivering on the promise and building trust with their end consumer is connecting with them on a values base. And we help retailers filter down our millions of products by the values that are most important to them. Something I love is that Not on Amazon is actually our most popular and used filter. And I think, what is that really saying? Well, it goes to the core of why independents are so important. Is because they need to be truly independent. If they have products in a selection that looks like everywhere else, then they're not kind of living up to their reason to exist and why they deserve to be there on our high streets. So making sure that they've got a kind of completely differentiated product selection, which is something we really help with, I think is crucial and super important to them.
It's so interesting that you said that, because I interviewed Theo Paphitis last year for the podcast, and his main point, I'm sure he said it at least 3 times throughout our conversation, was that retailers have to have a reason to exist. And I
Yeah,
think for independent retail, that's even more relevant, right? It's even more important. And I'm glad you brought up values based shopping, because I did want to mention it. And in my and Maya Knight's book about Amazon, our advice for other retailers was to focus on what we refer to as WACD, so what Amazon can't do. And at the
mm,
time, this was things like human touch, community, curation, discovery, inspiration, all those things that an amazing website, as amazing as it is, it's still very
mm,
transactional. And there's an opportunity there for retailers to come in and serve that need. And I found it so interesting that you were explicitly promoting exclusive finds that aren't on Amazon, and other things,
mm,
like you said, women owned, Black owned, LGBTQ owned. I mean, all of this
mm.
is so important for retailers to ensure that their values are fully aligned with the stuff on their shelves, and also to take a stance on issues, and to not, to be transparent about that. And for independent retail, I totally agree with you. I think it's so important, because shoppers will be able to see through it. They need to know that you're actually living and breathing the brand and the messaging that you're communicating.
Totally. I love what Amazon can't do. I'm going to take that acronym away with me. And it's something that when I chat with our retailers, that they have to live and breathe all day. I think there's clearly a huge and permanent place for Amazon in all of our lives, for the commoditized product and the commoditized experience and that convenience when you need it. But I think where other retailers and independents particularly have a unique advantage is as you say, and offering something really distinct and personal, and they need to lean into that as much as they can, and because consumers actually expect that from them, going beyond not just the product and the selection which Faire helps with, but also providing that level of recommendation, personalization, connection and authenticity, amidst a kind of mass market that can seem quite bland, I think is a real place where the independents can stand out. And as
Yeah.
kind of part of the community on their high streets often, there's so many of our retailers that are passing over part of their space to host events, invite people in, and it's not just a footfall driver, but it's a way of kind of really becoming embedded in their communities.
Now, earlier on in the conversation, we talked about the democratization of tech. So I wonder if you can elaborate on this in a little bit more detail and talk about some of the trends that you're excited about and maybe some of the successes that you're seeing within the independent retail community.
One of those successes that kind of connects with this digital transformation piece we've talked about is the way that small businesses are now getting access to more tools that previously were only available for the big players. Uh, AI in particular, I think, has been a success this year, where we've seen lots of the tools that small businesses were already using being sprinkled with the magic of AI and becoming available for them. Faire is just part of an ecosystem of SME focused tech that is leveraging the power of AI to help small businesses. I'm thinking of Canva Magic, which lots of our retailers use to hone their marketing, using GPT for getting emails out and making a sales plan. It's been really interesting and exciting to see the way that they've embraced these tools. And change is hard in a small business, particularly when since COVID, I've seen many of our independent retailers sadly have to let go of staff. They're perhaps working in the shop floor again when perhaps they hadn't in the past. And all of these tools are helping them save time, which they can then put back into the customer experience, which I think is really exciting. And another win that I've seen is there's been a lot of talk about vacancies on the high street, but we're actually seeing a lot of new retailers coming into the market and embracing Faire. We have a program called Open with Faire, which specifically helps new retailers. So we have a vantage point from that on who's entering the market and opening stores. And I think there's been a lot of press around store closures and gap-toothed high streets in the UK. But actually, I'm really seeing some green shoots from our vantage point of the hundreds of brand new retailers who have been inspired to open a shop, perhaps as part of a career change or as perhaps as their first careers, which is really exciting.
That's really exciting, and, as you say, it probably doesn't get the press that it deserves. It's usually the doom and gloom that dominates the headlines, but it's nice that we can talk about things like this. I just wanted to go back to something that you were mentioning about AI. I mean, that was so interesting what you were saying about how small businesses are probably a little bit, also probably a little bit more willing to embrace that technology because I know a lot of big businesses are still they see the potential, but they don't want to dive right in. And all of these things can just take longer in a large organization.
Yeah, for sure, and we see it at every level. So as Faire, we have this incredible depth of data when you think about the over 700,000 retailers that are buying from us, from brands on our platform, and we're using machine learning tools to make better and better recommendations to retailers about what do we think is going to work for your shop. And their customers, which I think is super interesting and is only going to get more powerful. Um, and it helps them then with finding that kind of unique product selection. And as you say, going back, it all goes back then into the customer experience. but absolutely, it's not, AI is not the reserve for global businesses and boardrooms. Actually, there's this really exciting ecosystem of tools that are specifically designed for SMEs, and to help them in extraordinary ways.
Yeah, and again, a phrase you said earlier, which I totally agree with, is leveling the playing field, which is great news for customers and for small businesses. Now,
Mhm.
Charlotte, I wanted to ask you a question. This is me just being curious here, but we are now in the golden quarter, and I would guess that a lot of buying has already happened for, the big retailers. But you said earlier in the conversation that one of the advantages of independent retailers using Faire is that they're able to purchase things closer to the event and that they're not tied in, 6 months, 12 months ahead of time. So I wonder if looking ahead to Christmas and Black Friday and all the events to come over the next couple months, is there anything that you can share with us today on the podcast?
Yeah, definitely. You're right. We're at the start, almost the start of the golden quarter. September was traditionally trade show season, and in fact, I've spent a good part of the last couple of weeks at shows, meeting customers in real life, which is great. I think how buying has changed is, rather than retailers buying for the season at those shows, they are perhaps doing research on Faire or in combination with visiting shows and making those in-person connections, and then buying much more little and often towards the season. I think there's a lot of anxiety, probably more so in the US than there is here still, on what that Black Friday week is going to look like. Something that we've thrown our support behind is actually more of an anti-Black Friday movement. I think these the super deep discounting that the major retailers do around that time just before Christmas is something that it's just not sustainable or realistic for most independent retailers, and actually finding a way to rally against that and just provide value year round and throughout the season. I think is something I've seen our retailers really champion.
Yeah, and I think it really goes back to our previous point about values-based shopping and the need for independent retailers to stick to their guns. It's a scary thing to do when the rest of the high street is offering very deep discounts, or at least the illusion of very deep discounts. But I think this is realistically what shoppers expect from their local independent retailers. And I think, not succumbing to those deals and not joining the race to the bottom will ultimately be a good thing for those retailers.
Yeah, I think Christmas this year is going to be really interesting. We've got, um, a new government will have had the budget by then. There are some signs that inflation has been easing, and some positive data that could flow through into how consumers are feeling about their pockets this Christmas. And I'm optimistic about it versus the last, but yeah, there's no denying that I will be on the edge of our seats through this quarter.
Charlotte, it's been really great to have you here, not just to learn about all the wonderful things that you're doing at Faire, but also to get your views as a female leader in this space. Now, my podcast has been going for about 18 months, and I'm really conscious that the majority of my guests have been white men. Nothing wrong with white men. I think most of my listeners fall into that demographic. But I am very much on a mission to have more diversity, more representation on the show. I think it's so important. And so, with that in mind, I'd love to switch gears now and spend the last few minutes getting your views on this topic. So, my very first question to you, Charlotte, is what do you see as the big barriers to getting women in tech?
Well, I wholeheartedly support you and your mission on this, and thank you for asking the question, because it's something that's top of mind for me. I think, I'm a new entrant to tech. I talked earlier that I spent my first 10 years of my career in finance, and then pivoted into retail. And I think there's a lot of myth busting to do about what are the prerequisites to have a career in tech that I think would help more women feel comfortable joining. Actually, about two-thirds of the jobs that we have at Faire, for instance, are for people without tech backgrounds. Computer science is not a prerequisite for women entering this world. I did a geography degree and have absolutely no tech experience and will probably never write a line of code. But I think myth busting around what it takes and what is required to join this world, I think is one key barrier. But encouraging and educating women to not be scared of uh, and not shy away from learning the basics, so that when it comes to thinking about and contemplating a career in tech, it's not an intimidating move.
It's funny. I had Sarah Welsh, who's the CEO of Retail for N Brown. She came on the podcast earlier this year, and we talked about women in retail. And she spoke so openly. It was a fantastic conversation. And something I asked her that I'd love to ask you as well is, I mean, how do you improve gender diversity? So what can, I guess, what can businesses do, but also what can the next generation of female leaders do?
Yeah, like representation at the top is one of the key ones for me, but also helping those women extend the hand through the organization from whether it's creating internship programs or mid-level career moves. I think keeping women in the workforce is a challenge that we see in particular, and helping women at the top be role models, but have a clear voice in creating career paths for women throughout the organizations, I think is super important. For me, it's been mentorship and keeping close connections and coaching type relationships with women inside and outside of the organizations that I've worked for, that have helped me get to this phase. But keeping the dialogue open across the career phase, I think is super important.
Fantastic. Charlotte, it's been such a privilege to have you on the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.